your name, calling out to you. Your glory like a fire, awakening desire will burn our hearts with truth. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart and filling every part of our praise. Your presence in this place, your glory on our face. We're looking to the sky, descending like a cloud. You're standing with us now, Lord, unveil our eyes. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart and filling every part of our praise. Yeah, open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart and filling every part of our praise. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart and filling every part of our praise. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, a mighty river flowing from your heart and filling every part of our praise. Show us your glory. Show us your power. Show us your glory, Lord. Let the King of my heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Oh, he is my song. You are good, good. Oh, you are good, good. Oh, let the King of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. Oh, he is my song. Let the King of my heart be the fire inside my veins, the echo of my days. Oh, he is my song, and you are good, good. Oh, 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 you're never gonna let me down. down. You're never gonna let me 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 down. You're never gonna
We debated all week as to what we should put on the graphics for the story for this week, and all we could come up with was a kettle, a pot. It's very glamorous, I know, but you'll understand when we get to the story here in just a minute. But first, a few more things that I forgot about earlier. I embarrassed her during Bible study this morning, but I would like to do it in here as well, too. So we can all look over there and say happy birthday to our very own Kim Carroll. Happy birthday to her. Everybody online can also tell her happy birthday. She'll see it later. But happy birthday to you. Also, as well, this morning, guys, should I tell the story that I told in Bible study? Like, should I bare my soul again? Was it that good? Okay, this would be a good lead-in for our sermon for this morning. But before that, Adam, please don't sing Bring the Rain anymore, by the way, because every time you do, it results in a gigantic winter storm, all right? So stop. He's brought the rain, he's brought the snow, he's bringing everything else, just stop. Okay, story here. When I can't remember how old I was, but I'm convinced I was upper elementary, and I was an avid baseball card collector. And I wanted my friend to come over and bring his baseball card collection. We were going to do a little swapping, little trading, I had it in my mind from the very beginning, I was going to do some upgrading on my baseball card collection. It just didn't happen how I supposed until I got in the moment. Satan tempted me, and what happened was we were on my parents' front porch on the deck there. They had a wood deck, and there were big gaps in between the slats of wood on the deck. And I would take some of his cards and I would look at him and be like, oh, I really want that card, but I don't want to give him any of my cards. Or if I do, I'm just going to give him a real trash cards. And so what I would do very covertly was I would take the card and I would be sitting by a slat and I would just put it down in the slat and drop it on the ground below the deck. So you know what happens after he leaves and he thinks he's got his whole collection intact and he's taken some things from me. We're all evensies. I went under the deck and got all those cards and, in my most sinister, dastardly laugh, I was like, oh, like I got it. And I bared my soul with that this morning, and everybody in the room, and now everybody who is here in this room, everybody's watching at home, anybody who watches for the rest of the time has now, their view of me has just decreased by that much. It probably wasn't very high in the first place, but now it's subterranean, your view of me, all right? But that goes very well with our story for this morning, but I have one more story to tell, and it's about Volkswagen. Everybody has heard of Volkswagen, they've seen it, they know the story of Volkswagen. What you may not know is that Volkswagen years ago decided and made it their mission that they were going to be the world's leading automaker. Which is a pretty big goal, by the way, right? When you're battling the Fords and the GMs and all those other car companies. So what happened was Volkswagen actually achieved this. It was our goal. They put everything into it and said, we are going to be the world's greatest automaker. And in terms of sheer just money, Volkswagen was that. They were at the top. They were at the pinnacle. The only problem is that to get there, they had to have some sort of a niche. Their niche was that they wanted to be the industry leader in clean diesel. All right, that's what they're known for. That's what Volkswagens are known for. And that's great and that's wonderful. It's a noble goal to want to be the leader in clean diesel, except for the way that they got there was not very full of integrity. It was found out actually that their mission to be the leader in clean diesel actually resulted in a 40% what was beyond the normal standards and the limits of what they had of nitrogen oxide. Right? You hear those words, you're like, that doesn't sound very good. It ain't very good. And so what they did is they found this out and they're like, guys, we got a big problem here. Like, we're the world leader. We're a leading automaker. But we are not within the threshold of where we need to be as far as nitrogen oxide is concerned. And so do you know what they did? They completely tricked the test. They would hook their vehicles up to this test and they would find a way to beat and cheat the test so it would not show that they were so far out of the limits. Which sounds awesome. You're like, ooh, that was pretty sly, until they got caught. And they got caught to the tune of, they're still dealing with it today from years ago, billions of dollars in lawsuits to dozens of countries around the world, and executives have been fired. And so they thought they had this really great idea, and it was to do they were trying to do a right thing. We want to be the best. We want to do something that we think is noble, have clean diesel. They did the right thing, but they did it in a wrong way. They wanted to be an industry standard setter, but they sought to achieve that goal in a less than stellar way. And I think that story really goes well with what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to be in Genesis 27 largely this morning, but we're going to start in Genesis 25. So if you just want to go to that area of your Bible. Guys, in all of the Bible, you would be hard-pressed to find a more pathetic chapter than Genesis 27. It's one of the saddest stories in all of Genesis, if not all of Scripture. Everyone in this story that we're going to read here in a minute is doing the wrong thing. Now, some of them think that they're doing really great things and they're doing it for the right reason, but they're just doing it the wrong way. But before we get to that, I want to set the story up by going back to the beginning of this family's soap opera in Genesis chapter 25. And specifically, we're going to start at verse 19 and read through verse 23 and then skip from there as well. Genesis 25, verse 19 says, "This is the account of the family of Isaac." Yes, it's the same Isaac we just met last week on Mount Moriah. "The son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, from Paddan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean." Whew, by the way, let's stop for a minute. That's a lot of stuff to fit into one verse there. A lot of weird names and words. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The same problem presented itself in the life of Abraham and Sarah. And here it is in the lives of Isaac and Rebekah. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant, not with just one child, but with twins. But the two children struggled with each other in the womb, and so she went to ask the Lord about it. "Why is this happening to me?" she asked. And the Lord told her, and this sets up really the rest of the story for this morning. "The sons in your womb will become two nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son." And then we skip down to verse 27, and we hear this really weird story about these two boys as they've grown up and now are adult males. Remember that as we read this story, by the way. They're adult males. "As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman." I'm like, he's rugged. He's a manly man. I mean, he's spraying off on him. This man oozes deep out of his pores. That's how deep into the woods he is. But Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. He sipped on his hot chocolate. He read his magazines and his books. I even told the group this morning he probably was at home knitting a sweater for himself and his mom. That's who Jacob was. Nothing wrong with that. They're just wildly different guys. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. By the way, verse 28, that's a problem, pain point right there already in this story. Do you guys understand this, right? You've either grown up in a family or you have your family of your own. You never play favorites, do you? Like, you may have your favorite, but you keep it very secret, all right? Or you only tell the person who's in your presence, "Well, you're my favorite." You don't play favorites. It never plays well in the family. One day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived home from the wilderness exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, "I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew I said this morning." Esau comes off very much like a caveman, doesn't he? Stew, me want, eat. That's all Esau is motivated by all the time. This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. "All right," Jacob replied, "but trade me your rights as the firstborn son." What you're thinking to yourself, this is really weird. Like, dude, he just wants stew. Like, why do you immediately go, I want your firstborn rights. That's what I want. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, why that was so important. Because we don't get that in our culture today. We're like, just give the dude stew. That's all he wants. "Look, I'm dying of starvation," said Esau. "What good is my birthright to me now?" But Jacob said, "First you must swear that your birthright is mine." And so Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all of his rights as the firstborn to his brother Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, got up, left, and he showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. Now, there are two things this morning that we need to kind of understand as we move in the rest of the story. There are a couple things at play here. There is what we've read right now, which is the birthright, and later what we're going to talk about is the blessing. And what often happens when you read the story of Jacob and Esau is we get these two things confused, or we think that they're the same thing. They are not the same thing at all. And we're going to talk about why that's so important to understand that and what results when Jacob tries to reach and grab for more than what's his. I don't know about you guys, but one thing that gives me a whole lot of encouragement from any of the early parts of Scripture and a lot of these stories that we've already read is that as great and as mighty and as heroic as these early fathers of the faith are, they're also as shady as can be, right? Like, do any of you read these stories and you just think to yourself, yuck, these guys are not good? I mean, this story this morning is like the highlight of that, of just, you read it, you feel kind of like dirty that you read that story. All of these characters have flaws and they have faults. They're just as human as you and I are. And like us, there is one thing, and we've been talking about this over and over again, it's going to be the highlight of this story today. There is only one thing that commends any of these people, and especially Jacob, to God, and you know what that is? His grace and His grace alone. There is nothing in Jacob that commends him to God. In fact, we sometimes look at the story of Jacob and Esau and we're like, we understand how this is set up. We're supposed to love Jacob because he's the good guy, and we're supposed to hate Esau because he's the bad guy. It's way too simplistic. In fact, if you really read the story and you read it enough, you're like, I really feel sorry for this Esau guy. And like, actually, in fact, Esau is the more likable of the two, if you really want to be honest. I mean, Esau is the guy that you could totally see yourself hanging out with. Like the good old country boy that just wants to have a good time. You're like, I want to go with him. Jacob is like just you're the stick in the mud, dude. I don't want to be with you. Esau has all the joy and the zest of life. But Jacob, not a good guy at all. And what is so interesting as we read this opening chapter of this family story is that all of the stories of Abraham, and again, remember that we are talking largely about, we've come from Father Abraham, who had Isaac, who now has had these twin boys, Jacob and Esau. This is really sort of a story still about Abraham. And all of the stories of Abraham that we have read or are going to be reading are in one way or another about somebody giving away the promise of God, going against the plan of God. I mean, think about it in Abraham's life. What does he do? He tries to give up Sarah on a couple of different occasions, doesn't he? Esau, here in the story that we've read, gives up his birthright. He has no regard for it. He has no respect for it. He sacrifices everything. Joseph's brothers, what do they do to him? They give him up into slavery, into Egypt. They cheapen and they mishandle the promised child. Guys, Isaac and his family are no different. You know, we think sometimes, by all accounts, Isaac's family should have been a wild, raging success. I mean, guys, we just read the story last week, didn't we? Abraham and Isaac trudging up the mountain. It wasn't just Abraham who had faith and trust. It was also Isaac who willingly went up to be sacrificed. And you're like, how in the world could this family is going to be perfect. This is going to be the model family. This finally, of all from creation until now, this is going to be the time that they get it right. But as Isaac aged, the family imploded. Why? It's because, we're going to find out as we read this story, all of the members of that family substituted scheming, conniving, manipulating for faith and belief so they could have their own way. Guys, I say this constantly, but is that not the story of our own time? We look out, and what is everybody trying to get? Their own way. Me. Mine. I want to be on top. And this is going to be a very major part of the story this morning, so I want you to be able to write this down. I want you to be able to circle this, underline this, highlight, whatever you need to do, guys. When we do not trust God for blessings, in His timing and in His plan, we begin grasping. I want it. Going after everything we can to try to hold on to it, to make sure that it's ours. Whenever we step outside of God's will, in His time and in His way, it always leads to grasping. Guys, everything about this family, everything about their story is out of order and backwards. But not in God's plan. As as chaotic as it's going to seem when we read through the story here just a minute, God is not caught off guard. God has a plan. God is working a plan in His wisdom and in His foresight. He knows exactly what He is doing, even when it seems like nobody else in the story does. And you're going to see that. You're going to be like, who's in control here, by the way? It is not Isaac. Rebecca maybe seems like she's trying to seize control here. Nobody is in control here. God is. God's got a plan. They're just not seeing it. And what starts here in Genesis 25, what we've already read, prepares us for the complete, utter, pathetic disaster that awaits us in Genesis 27. The introduction of Jacob and Esau here is very important because it's a setup for the entire story to let us know that trouble is on the horizon. Trouble is brewing. Get ready for it, boys and girls. This is a powder keg about ready to explode. If the promise of a blessing is going to be carried through Isaac, and that's what God has said, it's going to come through this child, Isaac, what in the world happens when two little snot-nosed rugrats show up on the scene? Like, guys, there's not a more, awkward moment in life. I realize I have to give a major blessing on to one of my children. There are two of them. What do I do here? I'm going to give it to one of them, and it's automatically going to cause a problem. I mean, you know this, right? If you've grown up with kids and you're like, we just played this game the other day, and I hate playing this game, where we're out at Costco, and Crystal walks by and she says, oh, look at this little Frozen outfit for Brylan. It's going to be so cute. I was like, it will be so cute. And she goes, well, what about this? What about this sweatshirt over here for Brenna? This would be really great for Brenna, wouldn't it? I'm like, what is going on here? And I'm like, yeah, it looks great. And she goes, well, that means we had to go get something for Braden now. I was like, what just happened here? The best thing I think we try to instill in our kids, the best thing you can instill in your kids or your grandkids, life ain't even and fair all the time. Some people get some things and other people don't get things, all right? That's the way it works. So what happens when there are now two people to try to share a blessing? You see, we have to remember the story. God had called Abraham to save the world through his family. His family was the only one that this promise went to. All the people of the world will be blessed through you. In each generation, he tells Abraham, there will be one bearer of the messianic seed. The Messiah will come through this one line. And one day, it said, the seed will be the Messiah who saves the entire world. The seed was passed on through Isaac, not Ishmael. That's his half-brother. Then the seed will be in one of Isaac's two sons, Esau or Jacob. Who is it going to be? Aren't you at this point be like, oh, I am intrigued to tell me. I will. Genesis 27. Here we go. The story goes this way. One day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called for Esau, his older son, and said, my son. This is very interesting, by the way. Isaac, for some reason, is like, I'm on my deathbed. I'm never going to make it. You know how much longer he probably lived? Another 43 years. I don't get this, by the way. I'm like, bro, you weren't dying. He's like a melodramatic diva is what he is. I'm dying. Bring me my son so I can bless him. Dude, you're going to live for another 43 years. I don't know what you're doing, all right? That's just a setup for the story. Yes, Father, Esau replied. I'm an old man now, Isaac said, and I don't know when I may die. So take your bow and your quiver full of arrows and go out into the open country and hunt some wild game for me. Prepare my favorite dish and bring it here to me to eat, and then I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die. Anybody see any problems there, by the way? Especially in that last line that I read. Bring it here so I can pronounce a blessing that belongs to you. Does the blessing belong to Esau? No, it never did. God made it very abundantly clear before these kids were even born. The blessing will come through the younger son, Jacob. And sadly enough, guys, this entire story, only 4 verses into this entire story, this whole disaster starts with one man, Isaac, head of the household. Isaac, same Isaac that we just talked about last week on Mount Moriah. We met him there last week. And immediately here in Genesis 27, we are introduced to a much older Isaac. We would think he should be a much wiser Isaac. But there's a very interesting character trait that is highlighted, and I don't want you to miss it. It says here in this translation, when Isaac was old and he was turning blind. And you're like, yeah, people do that when they get older, Ryan. That's not all that's going on in the story here. Other translations say it this way: when his eyes were so dim that he could not see. Do you hear it a little better in that translation? See, when the Bible talks about dim eyesight, it certainly can refer to physical eyesight, but much more it refers to spiritual eyesight, spiritual insight, discernment, wisdom. So what do you think it's saying automatically right off the bat about Isaac? This dude is not where he's supposed to be in God's plan. He's not seeing things very clearly in God's plan. It says in Abraham's story, and it says this very specifically, that when Abraham was old and he was well advanced in years, his concern was singularly focused on providing a proper wife for Isaac. That's not the case with Isaac, right? You know, what does the rest of the story say here? There are really two big problems I see right off the bat with Isaac. Isaac puts himself ahead of preparing for the Lord's plan. Again, when Abraham prepared for his death, he made sure that he was setting up everybody else for success and blessing. It wasn't about him. I want to make sure Isaac is taken care of. I want to make sure that everything's taken care of so everybody else will get the maximum impact of this blessing. What defined Isaac's life in the end, or what he at least thought was the end? What did Isaac want more than anything at the very end of his life? Did you catch it? A bowl of stew. I mean, it's not really flattering, is it, guys? It's like, what is your legacy going to be in life? I want soup. That's not a good way to go out, by the way. I do not want that to be anybody's last line in here. I mean, somebody once said it this way, guys. It encapsulates everything about Isaac. The end of your life reveals the ends of your life. What was your purpose? What were you working for? What were you wanting to achieve in life? Soup. That ain't good, guys. Right off the bat, there's a problem here. Not only does he put himself ahead of the Lord's plan, but he disobeyed the Lord's command very, very clearly. It was made apparent to Isaac and Rebekah, and some people would say, well, you know, they were older now, so maybe they just forgot that. How do you forget a promise that your son will carry on the seed of the Messiah and your descendants will multiply to be greater than the sand on the seashore? That's a pretty big promise, by the way. Do you forget that? Like, if I were to come to you today, I would say, Marvin, I will, in about 15 years, be able to give you $500,000. You better believe that when 15 years comes to the day, to the minute, Marvin's going to be like, where's my $500,000, bucko? You don't forget a promise that is major and big and life-changing. It was made apparent to both of these parents that the blessing was to run through the life of Jacob, not Esau. But what did Isaac intend to do? I want to give the blessing to Esau. Why? Because I love Esau. I don't so much like Jacob. He's kind of a sissy boy. Esau, manly man. I like him. He wanted to give it to Esau, who, by the way, if you were to read back into Genesis 26, completely disrespected and devalued his birthright. He married, it seems like he really is one of those kids that just wants to intentionally frustrate his parents. He goes out and he marries 2 pagan wives. Not from Israel, pagan wives. And he's like, I'm going to get you. You don't think you're going to give me the birthright and the blessing? I'm going to show you guys. He purposely seems to do that in spite of his parents. Did Isaac really not think that there would be a bad consequence to such a poor choice of going against the Lord's command? Guys, with someone like this leading the home, is it any wonder that things begin to fall apart very rapidly in the story? In the willfulness and stubbornness of his old age, he was determined to pass on the blessings to Esau, despite what the Lord had said and what the boys had shown in their lives. I mean, they showed their character from the very beginning. This is who they're going to be. Nothing ever changed. Esau was unspiritual and wild and untamed. Jacob was much more set on eternal things. And he valued what was given to him. And the fact that Isaac wanted to secretly dispense this blessing shows he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just naive. Guys, sadly, right off the bat in this house, no one trusted anyone. It is not a good, functional home. Isaac may have been the leader in this foolish episode, but believe me, he was far from alone in this atrocious display. We see our next character in the story come to us starting in verse 5. It is Rebekah. But Rebekah overheard what Isaac had said to his son Esau. So when Esau left to hunt for wild game, she said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I overheard your father say to Esau, 'Bring me some wild game and prepare me a delicious meal, and then I will bless you in the Lord's presence before I die.' Now, my son," this is, by the way, we love our mamas, right? But our mamas can be wrong, can't they? This is a bad, bad line right here. "Listen to me." Which in normal circumstances, when mama says, "Listen to me," what do? You listen to mama. But this was not mama doing the right thing here. This was not mama going along with God's plan here. "Listen to me and do exactly as I tell you." Yes, Mom, yes, "Go out to the flocks, bring me 2 fine young goats. I'll use them to prepare your father's favorite dish, and then take the food to your father so that he can eat it and bless you before he dies." Guys, instead of trusting God to fulfill what he had promised, what he had set in stone, what he had guaranteed, Rebekah used manipulation and scheming to accomplish what she thought should be God's plan. "Oh, no. You see, God, like I remember you telling me this. It actually goes to Jacob, and so I'm not really going to wait on what you do, but I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to scheme to get it." And likely, we pick this up in the story very clearly, it was also her preference to make sure that Jacob got it, because guess what? Remember what it said? She loved Jacob. Isaac loved Esau. Guys, that is what causes a major, major fracture in this entire family. Playing favorites. Charles Spurgeon once said it this way: "Good men, and in this case, in Genesis 27, women, have gone very wrong when they have thought of aiding in the fulfillment of promises and prophecies." See how Rebekah erred in trying to get the promised blessing for Jacob. And I love the last line here: "We had better leave the Lord's plans in the Lord's hands." Hear that. Hear that, everyone, all of us. It's better to leave with God what is God's and his alone. Don't try to tamper with it. Don't try to mess with it. Another commentator has actually taken a step further and has called Rebekah a deceitful, proud, selfish woman who wanted her way and not the Lord's. Ouch. Again, not a great legacy, not a great defining characteristic. Like, there's a fine woman. She's deceitful, proud, and selfish. But guys, this could have really been said about any of the 4 characters in this story. Rebekah's primary fault lay in failing to trust God to bring the blessing in his own time and in his own way. And the price for that, as we're going to read here in just a bit, I don't want to show the cards too much, but the price for it was 20 years in exile for Jacob. In all probability, I told the Bible study group this morning, that means that Rebekah never saw her son again after that moment when she had to send him away. The son that she loved dearly. The son that she had wrapped her entire life around was gone forever from her. Furthermore, it was an exile for which Jacob had not been prepared. Remember, he was a homebody, a mama's boy. He wasn't ready for that. And yet all of this was set in motion because they wanted to get outside of God's plan, guys. It is a really good reminder this morning that if you are not trusting God and you are trying to do your own thing instead of his, or even his will in your way, the path of disobedience is always going to be a really rocky trail to walk. It is always better to just wait on God at the beginning and in the middle and at the end of all things. Don't try to step outside of that. Someone has once said, the path of deceit is very, very hard. And the pleasure that we gain from it is never worth the price that must be paid for it. And then there was Jacob. Verse 11 tells us this: But look, Jacob replied to Rebekah, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and my skin is smooth. I love that, by the way. It makes me laugh every time I read it. Esau, hairy. Jacob, smooth. What if my father touches me? He'll see that I'm trying to trick him, and then he'll curse me instead of blessing me. Notice right off the bat, he's not really worried and bothered by the deceit and the ugliness of what they've just hatched in their mind. What's he really bothered by? I'll get caught. That's always the problem, isn't it? It's not that it's a really bad plan, it's that I might get caught in this. Or when I do get caught, it's not because I'm sorry, it's just because I got caught. But his mother replied, then let the curse fall on me, my son. Just do what I tell you. Go out and get the goats for me. And so Jacob went out, got the young goats for his mother. Rebekah took them and prepared a delicious meal just the way Isaac liked it. And then she took Esau's favorite clothes, which were there in the house, and gave them to her younger son Jacob. She covered his arms and the smooth part of his neck with the skin of young goats. And then she gave Jacob the delicious meal, including freshly baked bread. And so Jacob took the food to his father. My father, he said. And this right here, guys, gets to be a really, really big moral quandary. Yes, my son, Isaac answered. Who are you, Esau or Jacob? Jacob replies, it's Esau. Lie. Your firstborn son. Lie. I've done as you told me. Lie. Here's a wild game. Now sit up and eat it so you can give me your blessing. And Isaac asked, how did you find it so quickly, my son? He's lied like at least 3 times by now, but this is the worst one. The Lord your God put it in my path, Jacob replied. Yuck, lie, biggest one of all. He has now drugged God's name into his lie escapade. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come closer so I can, you can tell all the way along here, Isaac's like, something's off. I know something's not right, but I can't put my finger on it. Come closer so I can touch you and make sure that you really are Esau. And so Jacob went closer to his father, and Isaac touched him. And he said, the voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's, Isaac said. But he did not recognize Jacob because Jacob's hands felt hairy just like Esau's. By the way, I always want to ask myself, how hairy was this dude, by the way? I mean, that's one hairy guy. And so Isaac prepared to bless Jacob, but are you again, he says, are you really my son Esau? Yes, I am. Lie. Actually, there are probably about 6 lies that I count through these whole just few verses. Then Isaac said, now, my son, bring me the wild game, let me eat it, and then I will give you my blessing. And so Jacob took the food to his father, and Isaac ate it. He also drank the wine that Jacob served him. Then Isaac said to Jacob, please come a little closer and kiss me, my son. And when Jacob went over and kissed him, Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, and he was finally convinced, and he blessed his son. He said, the smell of my son is like the smell of the outdoors, which the Lord has blessed. Guys, right off the bat, when Jacob is introduced in this story, he begins to twist a very dangerous and wicked web. You know what Jacob could have done? He could have at any moment rejected his mom's overtures to deceive and to thieve the blessing, but he doesn't, does he? He learned from Mama really, really well. And as soon as he put on the goat skins and he carried that bowl of stew into that room, he was in the driver's seat. He wasn't just along for the ride. He wasn't some innocent bystander. One lie led to another, and deception after deception started to stack up. It was a tangled web that Jacob was weaving. Guys, he out and out lied about who he was in verse 19. He does it again in verse 24. He lies about the food. He invokes God's name. 6th lie was when Jacob kissed him because it was purposely misleading and full of deceit. You remember the night that Jesus is arrested in the garden, don't you? You see it again, and Judas comes to him and he kisses Jesus. And it says in one of the Gospels, you would betray me with a kiss. It went all the way back to Genesis chapter 27. The bottom line, guys, is that the covenant promise was Jacob's. It was his. He needed to do nothing for it. But that wasn't enough for Jacob. He wanted the land. He wanted the wealth. He wanted the power too. He had the most important promise to be given, but he wanted more. Guys, there is always a desire for more. It is never enough. Jacob could lie and he could bring God into that lie because his only concern was for doing what worked. Whatever it takes right now to get this blessing, I'm going to do it. Nothing is below me. And since he rightly knew that God wanted him to have the birthright or the blessing, he justified any lie or any sin that he committed. Ever been in that situation before? We're like, well, I feel like what I'm doing is right, so I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make it right. He likely did so, telling himself that it was all for a righteous cause. Guys, you know the line, don't you? The ends justify the means. No, they do not. Most certainly do not. It's interesting, Jacob's name literally means trickster or scoundrel. It came to be known or came to mean that to take by the heel, to trip up, to defraud, to overreach or overstep your bounds. That's what Jacob's name meant. By the way, not a real, so now nobody's ever going to name their kid Jacob. Or if their kids are thinking about naming their kid Jacob, like, don't do that. That's not a good name. What would later come to be borne out in Jacob's life was that he was constantly struggling for the best starting position. He was constantly nipping at his brother's heels, pushing his brother aside, knocking his brother down to get what he wanted in his way, in his time. What was so important about the blessing and the birthright anyways that Jacob wanted to rip away from his brother? Understand, in this culture, the firstborn received twice as much property as any of the other sons. More importantly, he became the head of the family. The spiritual leader of his people was a very important position and had power and prestige and money attached to it. In this case, it also involved being in the line that was to produce the Messiah. That's a pretty big thing, by the way. Jacob was right to desire the birthright. I mean, we can at least give that to Jacob. You're like, you really respected what the birthright meant. I mean, it's true he schemed to get it, and when he only really just needed to wait on God and God's timing and God's way. God had already said that the rights of the firstborn, they're yours, Jacob. Jacob, as we talked about with the very opening story with Volkswagen, Jacob saw a good thing in a bad way, in a wrong way. Because there was nothing wrong with what Jacob desired, but it was how he sought to get what he desired. Oftentimes in our life, here's the case. What we want and what we desire are not bad pursuits and desires and passions, but how we go about doing that is not good. It's bad. Which introduces us finally to the last member of the family, Esau. We pick his story up in verse 30. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and almost before Jacob had left his father, Esau returned from his hunt. You catch that? How just in the nick of time. They were almost like ships passing in the night, but he got out of there just before Esau showed up. Esau prepared a delicious meal and brought it to his father, and then he said, "Sit up, my father, and eat my wild game so you can give me your blessing." Isaac asked him, "Who are you?" Esau replied, "It's your son, your firstborn son. Daddy, you know me. It's Esau." Isaac began to tremble uncontrollably. And what the translation really is here, he trembled exceedingly, greatly. And do you know why he did, right? He realized right then that the jig was up. All this time he had been fighting against God, and finally, like he had engaged in this boxing match with God all of his life with his boys, and you know what finally was revealed here at this point? I just lost. God has knocked me down on the mat. Then who just served me the wild game, he says. I've already eaten it. I blessed him just before you came. And yes, for the very first time in a long time in Isaac's life, he is determined to do what God asked him to do. He will be blessed, and that blessing must stand. No going back on it. When Esau heard his father's word, he let out the most painful, agonizing cry. "Oh, my father, what about me? Bless me too," he begged. But Isaac said, "Your brother was here. He tricked me. He has taken away your blessing." And Esau exclaimed, "No wonder his name is Jacob, for now he has cheated me twice. First, he took my rights as a firstborn. No, actually, he really didn't. Esau, you gave it away. And now he has stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me?" Isaac said to Esau, I have made Jacob your master and have declared that all his brothers will be his servants. I have guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine, what is left for me to give you, my son. Esau pleaded, but do you have only one blessing? Oh, my father, bless me too. And then Esau broke down and wept. The same Esau that we just said, manly man, outdoorsman, hunter, is sobbing because he has lost out on everything in his life. Guys, Esau lived for the best things of this life, sacrificing the spiritual for the satisfaction of the physical, relinquishing eternal things for momentary pleasures. That was what defined Esau's life. Jacob was even-tempered and resolute. He had things under control. Perhaps he had them too under control. Jacob had the blessing of God, the promises of the covenant to Abraham, but he grasped for more power, more control, more abundance. Ironically, Jacob had the eternal in hand, but his greed caused him to grasp for earthly and unspiritual things as well. And we look at the story and we're like, you know what though? Like, Esau's kind of right. The birthright was his. That's the way it works in that culture. I mean, certainly his dad wanted him to have it, but you saw in Genesis 25 how little he took and thought of his spiritual advantages, that he virtually just threw it all away. I want you to listen to the words again at the end of that story. It says, Esau ate and drank and got up and left. By the way, I would add in this translation, again, I think he's such a caveman that this is the moment he gets up on the table, burps, and then just walks away. That's literally how this story goes. And it says, so Esau despised, hated, gave away his birthright. Guys, when God chose the younger over the older for whatever reason, that's God's plan. He upset the natural order of society and he introduced a whole host of opposition and antagonism. He upset the plans of man, but we shouldn't be all that surprised that discord and hostility was baked into this story, because from the very beginning, the people of this family have tried to do things their own way. Although God made it very, very clear that his plans are the best plans. And no plan begun by God will ever come up short or empty, but it will succeed every single time. And while the deception of Jacob and Rebekah seems to have succeeded, Jacob did get the blessing that he so earnestly sought. By the end of the chapter, it's clear, guys, that everybody in this story loses. Nobody wins. It's clear that both Esau and Jacob are grasping at this blessing, but only one is deserving. And although Jacob, goes about it in the wrong way. And here's the thing that I would say, this is really the big formula that's in this story here. We've talked about it already. The right reason plus the wrong way does not equal trusting that God's plan is best. Again, Charles Spurgeon says all four of them, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Esau, did not trust each other. And worse yet, they did not trust the Lord. Each one of them schemed and plotted against each other and against God. Guys, the story of this sad, tragic family highlights the possibility and the reality of what it looks like to lose by winning. Guys, in this story, no one won. I've talked about it a lot before. It's what's called a Pyrrhic victory. The story back in Greek lore about a guy named Pyrrhus who wins a war, but he loses all the people in the process, and there are many casualties. That's a Pyrrhic victory here in this story. Jacob and Rebekah get what they want, but everybody has lost. Guys, God has always provided direction for his people to carry out their responsibilities in his plan and in his program. And unfortunately, many people persist in handling them in very earthly ways, complicating matters greatly. Genesis 27 gives us a very detailed look at an entire family living their own way. It's a story of a family that splits over the pursuit of spiritual blessing. This should have been the model family, but it turns out to be anything but that. Everybody is at fault in this story. Isaac sets himself up to thwart God's plan by blessing Esau. Esau broke his word to Jacob. Rebekah and Jacob, with a just cause, went about achieving it by deception and manipulation. They would be victorious, but they would also reap the fruit of hatred and separation and fracturing this entire family. Jacob wanted what he believed belonged to him, but he went about it in a way that destroyed the chemistry of the family and the family completely. Because the story is not about Jacob. He alone did not destroy this family. They all displayed a level of pettiness throughout this whole story. And that's a very important thing to understand, guys, in life, is that God's plans are never threatened by our pettiness. No matter how base things become in life, or how carnal things become in life, or how much we scheme and deceive to get things, God's plan is never threatened by that. We'd be well served to understand that those who desire to grasp the promises of God need to let go of their own plans, and they need to take hold of God's plans. Guys, we only ever create tension and disharmony and brokenness when we attempt to set aside God's plans for our own. And unfortunately, God's people often attempt to guarantee the good things of God through His plan by deceptive and manipulative measures. And again, it may appear that our ways outside of God's will have succeeded, that we've won, but time always tells a very different story. Someone once said, the fate of all attempts to manage God's plans by keeping things dark and misrepresenting fact is written for all those who care to understand in this very story here. In the results of scheming of Rebekah and Jacob, they gained nothing. How many of you remember the movie of Willy Wonka? This sticks out in my mind every time I think about it. When he says at the very end of the movie, "You get nothing." That's it right here. This is the original Willy Wonka right here. They lost a great deal by their wicked interference in God's plans. They gained nothing, for God had promised that the birthright would be Jacob's, and it would have been given to him some way, but they lost everything. They lost a great deal. The mother lost her son. Jacob had to flee for his life. For all we know, Rebekah never saw him again. Jacob lost all the comforts of home, all the possessions his father had accumulated. He had to flee with nothing but his staff, an outcast to begin in the world for himself. And from this first false step onwards to his death, he was pursued by misfortune. Until his very own verdict. These are the words of Jacob at the end of his life. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. Not great words to say at the end of your life. Guys, eventually we have to come to the point where we realize how misguided our choices and our actions have been. We have to come to a point where we understand just how deceptive some of our actions are. Guys, Jacob is a very, very frightening example for how to get blessing in life. And you see what happens in the story, don't you? I mean, you see it on the surface, but there's something deeper going on in the story. Jacob became like somebody else. He hid himself and he dressed up as somebody else, someone that he was not. To get the blessing, Jacob could not be himself. He had to be somebody else. He couldn't be himself if he wanted to be blessed by the most important, significant person in his life. And do you know what's really scary about that? We all do this. To some degree or another, we all do this. To get the blessing that we so earnestly desire, and I feel like this is what so much of life is about for so many people. We so desperately crave attention and blessing and love and acceptance from the people around us that we ache for it. And so what we do is we become who we are not to get that blessing. Oh, they'll like me if I do this. Oh, they'll accept me if I do this. We pretend to be somebody that we are not. Because if you read Jacob's story, you'll discover that he had some very serious character flaws, and it doesn't just stop right here. His character flaws that God needs to deal with. Jacob was deceitful and he was conniving. He manipulated people. He controlled situations to get what he wanted. He cheated Esau out of his birthright. He stole his father's blessing that was meant for Esau. And through continued and perfected deceit, he gained a great amount of wealth. Even when he went off and he was in exile for 20 years, he cheated his uncle Laban at Laban's expense. And because of this constant conniving, he was continually on the run in his life. First from his brother, then from his uncle Laban. He was not a good guy. There comes a point in Jacob's life, 20 plus years after he leaves home, at the Jabbok River, you can read about in Genesis 33. Jacob struggles against God in this wrestling match where they go back and forth, and he refused to relent in his arrogance and in his pride. God had to physically disable Jacob by dislocating his hip, which caused him to walk unconvinced with a limp for the rest of his life. You know what God did there, don't you? He took away his ability to ever run again. He was very, very good at that. Instead, now Jacob had to face his problems head on in faith. Because the first fruit of that faith came the very next day when he met Esau. The stakes could not have been higher in this moment. He's seeing his brother for the first time in over 20 years. And we would expect that Esau would just let his wrath out on Jacob. But instead of receiving wrath, he was given grace. It's almost as if God was saying to Jacob, I've got this, Jacob. You have nothing to worry about. Let me work my plan. As Jacob had been caught in all this scheming and all this deceptiveness, and was confronted by the consequences of it, it changed him. This moment in Genesis 33 that you can look at completely changed and transformed him. He learned from the pain of his poor choices, which ultimately led to what I'm convinced is the model for true biblical repentance. Guys, he came to Esau that next day a broken and a changed man. And so we have to ask, why in the world would we even talk about Jacob? I mean, what in the world? Yuck. What is so special about Jacob that God would want to use him? And I think this is actually the better question. Why would God want to use any of us? Because truth be told, guys, we are all Jacobs. What Jacob struggles for and wrestles with for so much of his life is what all of us want. This is what every human being wants more than anything else. We want the blessing of the firstborn. Guys, here is the irony of all of it. We strive our entire life to get more and to want acceptance and love. And guess what? God has offered all of that to us and more. We want unique love from uniquely special people in our lives. We need a person we look up to say to us, there is no one like you. You are special. You are unique. I love you more than anyone else. This is exactly what God has done through his Son, Jesus Christ. And we miss it every single time. Guys, the choice of Jacob is proof of God's grace. He shouldn't have been picked. An Israelite thinking everything went to the firstborn son. He is not that. But in God's grace and in God's plan, Jacob is chosen. Guys, it is no different with us. All of it is God's grace. All that you are, all that you will become, all that you have, all that you will ever attain in life is all due to God's grace. Donald Gray Barnhouse, a commentator, says, the text, what we have read this morning, flatly states of the choice of God was not dependent on their birth or their character. Thank goodness. The choice was in the heart of God and based entirely on his sovereign authority and plan. This was God's divine purpose. The works and characters of the individuals had nothing to do with his choice. Here's how I would say and wrap all of that up. God chooses according to his good plan. Not ours, not somebody else's, his plan. Our being blessed or our being favored by God has nothing to do with our striving and our scheming and our angling. It's solely based on his mercy. Guys, God brings his grace and he works through very unworthy and very seedy people. Guys, there is almost nothing about Jacob that is appealing. I mean, with Abraham and with Isaac and a number of other biblical heroes, there are good chapters and there are bad chapters. But with Jacob, every single chapter in Jacob's life seems really, really bad. He doesn't do anything that's a good example. In a way, honestly, he is the weirdest person possible for God to choose and bless. But this gets us to the heart of this story and the biblical story as a whole. God brings his scandalous, intervening grace into the lives of people who don't seek it, don't deserve it, who resist it, who don't appreciate it, and even after they have been saved by it over and over and over again, they just dispose of it. Guys, God works every single day and every moment of history through sheer grace. Guys, we receive blessing and the good things of God only through his good grace. And any plan that is not God's plan is not the best plan. Guys, the way of salvation through our own effort is where we try to dress up and be who we aren't. We dress up for God through our effort, hoping or expecting that he will bless us. It doesn't work. Why? Because we'll be just as nervous as Jacob was when he was dressing up like somebody else and hoping not to be discovered and being found out as a fraud. Guys, the way of the gospel. This is truly the gospel, and here's where Jesus comes into this story. The gospel is that Jesus dressed up as us, so that he got the curse that we deserved. And then when God sees us, he sees us as though we did everything that Jesus did. When we believe in Jesus, we receive what is too hard to believe and too good to be true. We get the firstborn blessing. A Christian knows that God has loved them even as God has loved Jesus. We know that God's love, or we know God's love when we see Jesus losing the firstborn blessing so that we can have the firstborn blessing. When we see Jesus dressing up like us so that we can dress up like him. Jesus is the one who fulfilled what Rebecca said. You remember what he said, right? Let the curse fall on me. Jesus dressed up like us and got the curse we deserve so that when we believe in Jesus, we can be clothed like him. I love what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. He says this, "For his Spirit joins with our spirit to affirm that we are God's children." What more needs to be said? Stop. Stop trying to be what you are not. You are God's child if you are in him and have faith and trust and obey him. And suddenly this whole story in Genesis 27, through all the muck and all the mire, begins to be clear and make sense, doesn't it? You understand what's being said here. Ultimately, Jesus is the older brother who gives us the blessing and the birthright that was rightfully his. It's this grace that encourages our love for God. 1 John 4:19 says what? We love him because he first loved us. Guys, if we have any part in salvation, then our love for God is diminished and reduced by just that amount. Every single thing that you try to do to work and act and dress up diminishes what God can do in salvation for you. God, it is all of God. And if it is all of God, then all of our love for him ought to be boundless. We didn't seek God, he sought us. And when he sought us, we ran away from him. And when he came to us in the person of his Son, they killed him. And yet he still came. Still he chose a great number of rebels to receive salvation. What great love is this? It's why Paul says in Romans 5:8, God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Guys, God's plan truly is the best plan. Would you pray with me? Well, I pray that we would understand that this morning, and not just understand it, we would live it, believe it in all faith, that at any moment and throughout all of history, and for all of eternity, Your plan is the only plan that we really should be worrying about and following in. And so I pray that this day and from here forward we begin to, it's not easy, it's not simple, it's difficult to walk in faith, but that we would more and more every single day, step by step by baby step, begin to walk more clearly, fully, and faithfully in your will. It's in Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen.
Come all you weary, come all you thirsty,